What's up? What's going on, guys? Welcome back. So today I want to talk a little bit about this Sigma 17 to 50mm f2.8 lens for Canon. So I picked this lens up a couple months ago, and it's kind of been my go-to lens on my 77D ever since. Now I do a lot of street photography, a lot of cityscape stuff, so for me a 17 to 50 is kind of a good focal range. Before picking up this lens, my kind of go-to was my Canon kit lens, the 18 to 55. And you know, that lens was good for me for a while. I know I learned a lot using it. I got some really good images out of it that I was happy with. But after a while, you just kind of want a little bit more performance out of your lenses, and that's kind of where I was at. So I decided to do a little bit of research and pick up something new, and that's how I found this 17 to 50. And you know, I've just been really happy with it since picking it up. And I just wanted to do a short video kind of talking about it, talking about why I like it, why I think it's a good budget buy if you're looking to upgrade. You know, because I don't think a lot of people really know that these lenses exist. So one thing to note is this lens is an APS-C camera only lens. It will not work on a full frame camera. But you know, I think that's part of the reason why a lot of people haven't heard of it. But it's a really good buy if you've got like a 77D or a T7i or an 80D and you're looking to upgrade from that kit lens. I think this is a really good option. Now, one reason why I think it's a good option is that it's an f2.8 lens, so its maximum aperture is just a lot wider than the kit lens. You know, so the kit lens is stuck at f3.5 at its widest. So with this, you're going to let in a lot more light. You know, you're going to be able to lower that ISO and get a much cleaner, noiseless image, which I think is important. Personally, I don't want that much noise in my image. I want to have as little in there as possible. You know, that's kind of the whole point in my opinion. If I need to add noise, I guess I could. I don't think I ever would. That's not really my style, but I know some people want to. But for me, I'd rather start with as clean of an image as possible and then go from there. So by having an f2.8, you can keep your ISO lower, get a much cleaner image. I think that's really important. You know, another good thing about having an f2.8 lens is that, you know, at f2.8, you can blow out that background a little bit easier, right? So if you want that nice depth of field, if you want to separate your subject from the background, having that f2.8, having that extra ability to open up that aperture is going to make that a little bit easier to do. Something else that I disliked about the kit lens is the fact that it's a variable aperture lens, right? So it starts at f3.5, but then as you zoom in to 55mm, it closes down to f5.6. You know, this on the other hand, it's f2.8 throughout the entire zoom range. Now, it only goes up to 50mm, but to be honest, I haven't really noticed much of a difference between the 50 and the 55mm focal range. To me, the 5mm isn't something I've missed. It's not that big of a difference. So I don't really feel like you're really losing out that much there, but you are gaining a whole lot by having that constant aperture throughout the entire zoom range. You know, because, well, one, you know, at the far end of the focal range on this guy, you're gaining 2 extra stops of light. That means you can drop your ISO basically 2 full stops, you know, given all of the things are the same, which means you're cutting your noise down by 1/4 of what you would if you were shooting in that same scene with the kit lens. So to me, that's pretty huge. That's a big deal to me. I also like the fact that it's a constant aperture throughout the entire zoom range, simply because, you know, there's been scenarios where I've got my scene set up, I've got my exposure set correctly, you know, at 18mm and 3.5 for the aperture, you know, and then I decide I want to get in and take a slightly closer, more detailed shot. So I zoom in. You know, the problem is though, as you zoom in from 18 to 55, your aperture is going to close down to 5.6. You know, so unless you're thinking about it as you're doing it and making the appropriate changes, you're going to go from having a properly exposed image to having an underexposed image. Whereas with this, you just don't have to worry about that. You know, you can start at 2.8 at 17 and zoom into 50 and still be at 2.8 and not have your exposure change. You know, especially if you're doing video. You know, that's an even bigger issue if you're doing video and you're having your exposure change, because then whoever's viewing that video is going to notice a very apparent change in the overall, you know, lighting of the scene. So to me, having that constant aperture through the zoom range is another big plus. I also really like the fact that this thing is optically stabilized. Now, there's a lot of lenses that people look into upgrading to from their kit lens that are not optically stabilized. The Canon 24-7, for instance, or 24-70, for instance, that's not an optically stabilized lens, and it's also a very expensive lens. You know, this on the other hand, it's a very affordable lens and it is still optically stabilized. So to me, that's another huge plus that this, you know, lens really has, it really sells me on. And then finally, I guess the last thing I'll say about it is just that compared to the kit lens, it's just a much better overall build quality. You know, it's a little bit heavier, but that's probably because the glass inside is a little bit thicker, a little bit better quality. But to me, I don't mind the fact that it's heavier. I think it just feels more professional, it feels more rugged. The overall, you know, casing of this lens just feels better. It feels like it's going to last a lot longer. It doesn't feel like it's something that's going to break or get crushed really easily in your bag. So to me, it's an all-around better lens, although there are a few downsides to it. So one of the things that kind of drives me a little bit nuts about this lens is that the external focusing ring on it It's actually tied to the internal motor. It doesn't spin freely like it does in the kit lens. And that is kind of a pain sometimes because I'll be out taking a photograph, my finger will be resting on the zoom ring. If I go to half press the shutter to autofocus, my finger kind of jams up the focusing motor a little bit. It makes a weird noise. It misses focus, you miss the shot. I don't shoot weddings with this lens or this camera, so to me it's not a huge deal if I miss a shot, but it is kind of a minor inconvenience. It can be annoying, and I think it's worth noting. One other thing that I don't like about it, really the only other thing that I don't like about it, is that the focusing motor is very loud. So if you're going to be shooting in video with continuous autofocus turned on and you're using the internal microphone or possibly even like a Rode video mic, it will pick up the sound of that motor. So that's kind of a pain if you plan on using it in that sort of fashion. But if you're going to use this lens in video mode and you plan on manually focusing, or you plan on using something like a boom mic or maybe a lapel mic, then it probably won't matter for you. But again, it's something to take note. Or I guess another scenario is if you just want to use it to shoot B-roll and then, you know, replace the audio with like a music overlay, then again, that might not be a big issue for you that the motor's a little bit loud. But again, it's something I've noticed with this lens, and it's definitely something that I wanted to bring up. And that's why, it's part of the reason why this video I'm filming it with the kit lens still, because that STM motor is just super quiet. But yeah, other than that, those are really the only two criticisms I have of this lens. I think other than that, it's super solid. Now, as far as price, so Canon makes a 17-55mm f2.8 lens, so same kind of deal, APS-C only lens, same rough focal range. But that lens starts brand new at about $1,000. You can pick it up used for roughly, I've seen around $600 to $700. And then there is a Tamron version. It's also a 17-50 f2.8. Although that one is not optically stabilized, and brand new it starts at $650, and you can find copies used for around $400 to $500. Now this lens, on the other hand, though, you can actually buy it brand new from Sigma or B&H or really anywhere, brand new for $350. So it's like half the cost of the Tamron and almost a third of the cost of the Canon brand new. Or you can do what I did and go on eBay and buy this lens used for roughly $200 to $250. Now to me, at $200 to $250, I mean, that's essentially the same price as a kit lens brand new, and you're getting a whole heck of a lot of performance out of something that's only $250. So, to me, if you can't justify spending the money that you would on, say, like a Canon 24-70, where you simply just don't have the money to spend on a lens that's that expensive, but you still want to upgrade from your kit lens, I think these are a totally awesome budget option that get you a lot of performance for not a whole lot of money. So, you know, if you're looking to upgrade your kit lens, you just don't want to spend a lot, definitely look into these Sigma 17-50 f2.8 lenses. I think they're a total steal at the price that they're going for. So definitely give them a look and go check them out. Now beyond that, that's really all I want to do. That's really all I want to wave this thing around for. So actually, I'm done with this portion of it. Let's actually head over to Lightroom and I'll show you some kind of comparison shots between the kit lens, the 18-55, and this Sigma 17-50. Let's go. Alright guys, here we are in Lightroom. I've got a couple images loaded in, and so these were some shots I took the other day at sunset after some rain had rolled through. These aren't really meant to be, you know, great shots. They're just simply for kind of demonstration purposes to kind of show you what the differences are between the kit lens and this Sigma 17-50. So anyway, so on the left hand side we've got the kit lens. I shot this one at 18mm, 1/50th of a second, f3.5, and ISO 400. Now I chose ISO 400 over 100 because I just roughly wanted to set the exposure for the scene where I would normally want it to be if I was actually taking this photograph for personal reasons. So you can see the sky is somewhat exposed for, the ground is somewhat exposed for. I probably could have gone a little bit higher on the ISO, but I think I would have been overexposed at that point, and I didn't really want to change the settings too much. I really wanted to leave the shutter speed at something I could use shooting handheld. And then I wanted to have the aperture at the maximum aperture. So ISO 400 was just kind of the closest ISO I could get to and keep it properly exposed. So anyway, on the right hand side then I've got the Sigma 17mm, again at the widest focal length at 17, again 1/50th of a second, ISO 400, but in this case I went with the widest aperture on this lens, which is of course f2.8. Now again, the whole purpose of just showing these two shots is just to demonstrate the fact that having an f2.8 lens does allow in more light. So for one, this image on the right hand side was actually taken a few minutes after the one on the left, which means there was less light naturally in the scene as the sun was setting pretty quickly. But even still, you can see that there's still more light in the right hand image. It's still a brighter overall image because of the f2.8 aperture. So again, that's just another benefit of having that wider aperture. Now, this is really pronounced when we actually go and we compare that at 55 or 50 millimeters for the other lens. Let's get that second one pulled up here. Okay, here we go. So now on the left-hand side, we've got the kit lens at 55 millimeters, and on the right-hand side, we've got the Sigma at 50 millimeters. Now, on the left-hand side, we see that, again, the aperture, because it's a variable aperture lens, it ended up stopping down f5.6. Whereas on the right-hand side, we've got the Sigma lens, which, because it's a constant aperture throughout the entire zoom, it is still at f2.8. And again, so this is where we see the really big difference between having these two lenses, is that the Sigma maintains the same exposure as you zoom into the far end of the focal range, whereas the kit lens does not. Now, it's not necessarily a huge deal, but the problem that you run into is, so if you're properly exposed, again, like I said earlier, at 18 millimeters, and then you zoom in, now you're underexposed. This is definitely an underexposed image. This definitely needs to be brought up. This one on the right is probably a little bit underexposed too, but it's pretty close. But anyway, so you do lose a lot of light under the kit lens once you zoom in and you stop that aperture down to 5.6. Now, in order to compensate for that, you would have to end up bringing in... So here's two images. Well, the one on the right is still the same, but the one on the left now is the same lens, the 18 to 55, at 55 millimeters, but in order to compensate for that f5.6 aperture, I had to bring the ISO up 2 stops. Now, I shot this at 800 as well, but 800 was still way too underexposed. Now, 1600 is probably a little bit more exposed than the ISO 400 on the right-hand side with the Sigma lens, but the 1600 was much closer in matching the exposure than the 800 was. So in any case, these are now roughly the same. There's still a little bit difference in terms of overall exposure, but they're as close as I could get it. And again, so the whole point of just showing these two images is simply that if you've got this kit lens on the left-hand side, you zoom in to 55 millimeters, you're forced to stop your lens down f5.6. You have no control over that. So in order to compensate for that, there's two things you could do. You could either, one, lower the shutter speed, but the problem is I'm already at 1/50th of a second. I'm shooting at 55 millimeters, and so the inverse law tells you that, if in order to reduce motion blur or to eliminate motion blur, you need to have a shutter speed that is 1 over your focal length. So I'm already pushing it right here a little bit. So I really can't lower my shutter speed any more than I already have. So that means I'm pretty much stuck with my only option being raising the ISO. So I had to do that. I had to raise it up 2 stops in order to match it. And now that kind of makes sense, right? Because over here on the right side, we've got f2.8, ISO 400. So on this side, I had to, the lens automatically shut my aperture down to f5.6. That's a 2-stop difference. So in order to compensate for that, I had to bring my ISO up 2 stops to 1600. And so there we see, it all makes sense. It balances out, and we get the expected result. Now you might say, okay, well, that's not really a big deal, right? So what? You got to raise your ISO by 2 stops. Well, if we go ahead and we zoom in on these two images and we compare them, we can see that on the left-hand side, this image has got quite a bit more grain. It's much coarser grain. It's much more noticeable. Whereas on the right-hand side, it's much softer. There's still some noise in the image. There's still some graininess, but it's much softer. It's much flatter. It's not as noticeable. And I would say that the left-hand side image at 1600, it's still very usable. It's not really bad. It's moderate amount of noise, but it's definitely a big difference over the right-hand side. And, as is, you're not really going to notice it too much, but if you start to play with the settings, you start to bring up your shadows, you start to bring up your exposure a little bit, this grain on the left-hand side, because of the 1600 ISO, it's going to become more pronounced and even more noticeable, whereas on the right-hand side, you'll have a little bit more latitude to play with your exposure and your shadows and bringing up those sliders. So, again, that's really all I wanted to show with these two images. Now let's go ahead and pop over to these two images to kind of just show the difference in sharpness between the two lenses. Now on these two, this was just something I did indoors with some lighting inside. I didn't really have time to do anything outdoors to really properly show the difference between the two in terms of sharpness. But again, so I shot these using a tripod, so the distance between the camera and this other camera that I shot didn't really change. I focused just on this logo right here, this EOS Rebel G logo. And so let's go ahead and zoom in on that and let's take a look at some stuff. So again, I shot this on a tripod, so I've got the same shutter speed, 1/6 of a second on both of these. I bumped them both up to f8 because that's kind of where you start getting into the sharper, sweeter area of the lens. So I got those both bumped up to f8, and of course they're both at ISO 100. Now, one thing that I thought was interesting is that On the left-hand side, you can see that the kit lens says I'm at 41 millimeters, whereas on the right-hand side, it says with the Sigma, I'm at 43. But the interesting thing is, it looks like even though the kit lens is technically not zoomed in as far, the image definitely looks like it's further zoomed in. This EOS Rebel G logo is definitely bigger on the left-hand side than the right, so I thought that was interesting. But other than that, comparing the sharpness between the two, I would definitely say that the Sigma is definitely sharper. If we look at the edges of these letters here, it's definitely a little bit softer on the kit lens than it is on the Sigma. Now, I did take a few shots with each lens, focusing on the same area, and I picked the sharpest of all of the all of the shots between the two lenses. So, you know, I'm kind of doing, I tried to give them both the benefit of the doubt and pick the best from each lens. And even still, I would say, yes, the Sigma is definitely a little bit sharper. And that's pretty much all the way through this image. If we go over here and we look at this flash button, definitely a little bit sharper on the Sigma side. And again, if we move up here, we look at the AF, MF printed thing here, it's definitely a little bit sharper on the Sigma. And again, if we look at the Canon logo up top, again, definitely sharper on the Sigma side. And again, these were both shot on a tripod. The tripod didn't move. They're both shot at f8. They should have the same depth of field, but the Sigma is definitely a little bit sharper. Now, another thing I noticed with this lens is that it definitely appears to be a little bit cleaner. Even though they both have the ISO, is still the same. I feel like on the right-hand side, I feel like it's a little bit cleaner. There's a little bit less noise, and it's also slightly more contrasty. The image on the left-hand side with the kit lens, to me, it just overall looks a little bit flatter. There's not as much color into it, whereas on the right-hand side, definitely more color. And again, the lighting was the same, tripod was the same, everything was the same except for the fact that these two lenses were swapped out. But yeah, so anyway, so you know, end result here, moving up to a nicer lens, you also get the benefit of just having something that's going to provide a sharper, better quality image just because it's got a larger, heavier, better quality piece of glass inside. So again, another benefit of going ahead and upgrading from that kit lens. Alright guys, so I just realized that I never filmed an outro as I'm sitting here editing this video. So with that said, hopefully you found some good information in this video. Hopefully you found this review a little bit useful. Maybe this will be a lens that you're interested in checking out for yourself. If you found this useful, go ahead and leave a comment down below and let me know, and hit that thumbs up button. And that's it. So until next time guys, be safe, take care, and keep shooting. I will see you in